Thank you, everybody. First of all, I have to start with a disclaimer. I think it will be obvious from the introduction. Even though I'm a faculty member in the School of Nursing, I am not a nurse. If you have a health emergency during this afternoon, I am useless, except I can dial 911. That's about the extent of it. Is Justin Bednow here? Is Justin here in the hall? Justin? Okay, well, Justin is a nursing student, and he will be presenting a little later, so we'll call upon him if there are any problems. The theme of the TEDxUConn talks this year, From Zero to Hero, got me thinking about a research question that has driven much of my research for the past 10 years. Specifically, how has an area of work which 150 years ago was very disreputable, how in 150 years has it become one of the most, if not the most, respected and ethically regarded professions in America, and has been for about 20 years, according to the Gallup polls. That question has continued to drive my own research as a humanities scholar in the School of Nursing. 150 years ago, most health care was provided in the home, and you had nursing care from a family member or from a neighbor. But what happened if you didn't have a family member or a neighbor to provide you with nursing care? You had to rely on paid nursing. And paid nursing 150 years ago was considered very disreputable. Perhaps the classic example is a Charles Dickens character named Sari Gamp. Sari Gamp's interest in her patients was primarily for what she could get from them. She was alcoholic, she was dishonest, she was larcenous, she was predatory. So that was the image of nursing 150 years ago. That began to change when Florence Nightingale, who had distinguished herself as a military hospital nurse in the 1850s in the British Crimean War, came home and published this little book, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not. Now, Nightingale herself had come from an affluent family. They did not want her to be a nurse because paid nursing was a disreputable line of work. She insisted on it, studied in Germany, distinguished herself in the Crimean War in a military hospital. And when she came back, this book provided the foundation for what eventually became the Nightingale Schools in England to provide professional education for nurses. At the same time, her basic principles of nursing, namely good nutrition, quiet environment, good ventilation, cleanliness, provided the foundation for modern nursing as well. At the same time, she had a kind of gendered essentialism, if you will, about nursing. She felt that all women should and could be nurses, that there was something in the nature of women that nursing came naturally to them. This situation also pertained 150 years ago at the beginning of the American Civil War. Now, any of you who are students of the American Civil War know that both sides, both the Confederacy and the Union, believed that the war would be over very quickly. As a result, very few provisions were made for military hospital care of soldiers. At this period, the typical military hospital nurse was a recovering soldier who was sufficiently well to be able to take care of more infirm or more sick fellow soldiers. Not a very good model for nursing. By the war's end, and of course the war is from 1861 to 1865, by the war's end, more than 20,000 Union women had entered into military hospital service. Many of them coming from small towns and villages here in New England. Most of them were not trained. Many of them were not even paid professionally. They were volunteers. And so they served with distinction, often risking their own lives to wartime trauma, to illness, and to the other difficulties attendant upon service in a military hospital. There are the three nurses that in particular I want to focus on are these here. Emma Edmonds, whom I'm calling the sensational nurse, and we know of her story because of the book she published, Nurse and Spy in the Union Army. Mary Ann Bickerdike, also known as Mother Bickerdike, whose story is published in a collection of narratives by Frank Moore, published at the end of the war. And then finally, in a memoir published in the 1880s, the story of Mary Livermore at the end of the war. Mother Bickerdike I'm calling an assertive nurse. I'll explain that in a moment. And Mary Livermore an executive nurse. Now, Emma Edmonds was a remarkable figure. She was Canadian. She was on a train coming to do missionary work at the outset of the American Civil War, and she just decided to contribute her talents to the war effort. And she contributed in two interesting ways over and above serving as a nurse. And that is, first of all, she was a spy. Among the many costumes and disguises that she used, she darkened her skin in order to pose as a contraband, that is to say, as an escaped slave. She also posed as an Irish laundress in order to infiltrate Confederate lines. A little later, though, she also dressed as and lived as a man and served for a while as a soldier, for which after the war, her service was honored. Indeed, a sensational nurse. Mother Bickerdike literally felt that the soldiers under her care were her boys, and she would not stand for any corruption by medical officers at the time, or any high-handed decisions and behavior by those medical officers. Her boys came first, the healing and care of her soldier patients. No less a person than William Tecumseh Sherman, when officers complained to him about her, said, "There's nothing I can do. She ranks me." Later still, when a medical officer complained to her about her insubordination, and she was frequently insubordinate in the care of her boys, asked her where her authority came from. "Almighty God, do you know of any higher one?" So she was not going to put up with the corruption or the malfeasance of male physicians, army officers. Finally, Mary Livermore. Mary Livermore, before the American Civil War, had a distinguished career as an abolitionist. She was also involved in the temperance movement, opposing the abuse of alcohol. Her husband was a Unitarian minister. He had a parish not far from our campus here, up in Stafford Center. During the war, she and her husband were living in Chicago, and she became an executive in the U.S. Sanitary Commission. She became a leader in marshaling the resources in order to provide all the kinds of medical care and medical materials needed to provide in the hospitals. In her book and in subsequent journalistic writing during the war and afterwards, Mary Livermore made it clear that women's contribution in military nursing was the equivalent of the kind of wartime service that soldiers were providing, that both were equal and both were significant and important. This experience, plus her husband's persuasion, converted her to the woman's suffrage movement, the movement on behalf of women's right to vote. Now, how did these people distribute or circulate their stories? There was an interesting mass media model that flourished in the United States in the middle and late 19th century, and its headquarters was nearby in Hartford, which was the capital of the subscription publishing business. Here's how it worked. In small towns and villages throughout the United States, which were not large enough to have a library or a bookstore, local people served as book agents, also called canvassers, and they would go around their neighborhoods, go around their towns, go around their counties, and with samples of the books, they would show their neighbors the books and get them to sign up. Here you see a picture of one such page in which people are signing up for a number of copies and a certain kind of binding for the books. Now, what's significant about this is that both men and women acted as canvassers. And when a canvasser came to your home, they didn't have the whole book yet because you were going to be a subscriber to support its publication. What they had were excerpts, portion of a chapter, samples of steel plate engravings or chromolithograph prints. In other words, much as today when you go onto Amazon or go onto Barnes & Noble and they invite you to take a peek inside the book, you can take a look at 10, 15 pages of a book. This was the prototype, taking a little sample of the book before buying it. So people all around the country had an opportunity to be exposed to these heroic stories of people who had come from small towns and villages and distinguished themselves in service to the Union. It seems to me that there are three consequences for this. First of all, women's wartime nursing service provided the foundation for what in less than a decade after the war would be the movement to create nursing schools, formal professional nursing schools, starting in 1873 with Bellevue Hospital's school. This also distinguished nursing, paid professional nursing, as an honorable and distinguished line of work for women. This was particularly important and needed in this period of American history when so many women found themselves unable to get married because such a significant number of marriageable men had been killed, or who found themselves widowed or found themselves with their husbands disabled and unable to work as a result of the war. The second thing that women's wartime service did was it provided the impetus for pensions for the nurses who served. Now, it would still take about 30 years before the Nurse Pension Act was passed. And there were considerable arguments about whether pensions were a good thing or not. Republicans robustly supported pensions. Democrats vigorously opposed pensions. The Democrats claiming pensions are un-American and they promote an un-American dependence on the government, and they'll bankrupt the federal budget. Yeah, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The parties may have switched, but the story remains the same. Finally, the third thing, and I think in some ways this is the most interesting and most important, women's military hospital service provided the rhetorical foundation for the woman's suffrage movement. The claim had been made, and keep in mind in the 19th century, voting is not considered a right, it's considered a privilege, and it's considered a privilege only for those who can serve in the military and defend their country in military service. What women demonstrated was they risked their lives, many of them were injured, many of them were died in service to their country. Their service was just as dangerous in many respects as that of soldiers. And this provided evidence of an argument that women could and in fact did serve their country and deserved the privilege of voting. And as Mary Livermore pointed out, Horace Greeley espoused this military argument, and she reported, it's been reported of her, "I know women who could whip Horace Greeley out of his boots clean." She wasn't going to accept that argument by any means. Finally, to answer the question I posed at the beginning, how did nursing in the United States go in 150 years from zero to hero? Two things. First of all, it seems to me, from the start of professional nursing outside the homes, nurses distinguished themselves as vigorous, ethical defenders of their patients. And second of all, it took nurses telling their stories in the mass media of their day to be able to show the value that they brought to society and to the well-being of society, from zero to hero. Thank you.